Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kathy. Today I'll be sharing a card using the set of Kitties stamp set from Stamping Bella, the Merry Pigs stamp set from Hello Bluebird, and the postage Slimline die from Whimsy Stamps. I started out by stamping the images onto a piece of 80-pound Cougar Super Smooth cardstock, and I used My Favorite Things Extreme Black Hybrid ink. Both the cardstock and the ink are Copic friendly. And normally I use Neenah Solar White cardstock when I do Copic coloring, but I had run out of that and remembered that I had the Cougar Super Smooth in my stash. I do want to go over this cardstock a little bit. I found that the Copics behave a little bit differently on this cardstock compared to the Neenah cardstock. Actually, it reminded me a lot of how the Copics behave on Express-It cardstock. So before I get into all of that with the cardstock, I do want to go over how I colored these little kitties. And you'll see that I go off screen with my marker every now and again because I just refilled it and it was really full and I was afraid of getting a big old ink blob. So I just kind of swipe it off on a piece of scratch paper up on the side there. So for this first kitty, I started with BV25 and added in where the darkest areas would be and literally just did tiny little scribbles. I wanted to have the kitties look like they were furry and that there was some texture, so that's why I did little scribbly marks rather than the normal flicking motion that I would do. The second color that I used for this kitty is BV25. And I did go over, nope, sorry, that's BV23. And I did go over my darkest color, which is the BV25. And that is when I started to notice how quickly the cardstock becomes saturated with the Copics, which in turn blended the colors really very easily. The third color that I used on this kitty is C1, and I went over all of the other marker colors that I had used. And C1 ended up being a little bit too light, so I decided to come in with N2 and filled in, and I was much happier with that compared to the C1. I came back in with the BV23 just to add in a little bit more texture, and then that pretty much finished up the kitty. So I did the same technique for all the kitties. I just did the scribbling motion and I worked dark to light. And as I had mentioned previously, the markers seem to behave a little bit differently on this cardstock compared to the Neenah Classic Crest. I do like how the colors blend a lot faster. So I feel like I'm using a lot less ink from my markers. And I'm really happy with this cardstock. And I had quite a bit of practice because this is the cardstock that I used for the Christmas cards that I made to actually mail out. So I had colored, oh, I don't know, about 60 little Merry Pigs. So I did have some practice, and it does take a little bit of getting used to. The one little tip that I can give you when using this particular cardstock is as much as you're going to want to go back in to blend something out, wait a while because it seems like the ink stays wet a little bit longer and eventually they just kind of all meld together and blend beautifully. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about this cardstock is the price point, because the Express-It cardstock, which is a very popular cardstock that people use with Copic markers, it's pricey. I mean, for 125 sheets of cardstock, of the Express-It cardstock, that'll run you about $45. The Neenah, for 250 sheets of Neenah Classic Crest 80-pound cardstock, that'll run you about $32.50. But 250 sheets of the Cougar Super Smooth 80-pound cardstock is $28. So it's a great value. I really have enjoyed using it with my Copic markers. And like I said, I used it a lot. So I'll make sure to have everything linked in the description below. I will also have all of the individual colors that I used for the coloring listed down below in the description as well. Now moving on to the next topic, and this is going to be, I'm just going to say it really fast and then move on and talk about my new lamps. So I know it's been a while since I have posted a video, and a big part of that, if you happen to follow me on Instagram, you may have seen my posts and you might already have an idea why. But back on Halloween, my niece lost her life in a motorcycle accident. And 8 days after that, we had to help our little Jacob cross the Rainbow Bridge. So my heart was broken twice in a matter of 8 days, and it's taken me a little bit of time to kind of come back from all of those emotions. So there, I said it. I'm done. I'm moving right along back to talk about these new lamps, which I ended up getting these new lamps because the bulb went out on my old lamp. And when I replaced the bulb, the light seemed to be very blue, and I was having issues with the lens on my camera would open up, so I would end up with these huge flares. So I was having major issues with that. Anyway, I did research and I found a new desk lamp, and I actually ended up buying 2 of them. And there is a little bit, I know that you can see a glare on my craft mat, and that's just because I haven't quite found the sweet spot for the lamps so that there isn't a glare. For this particular video, I just tried to crop it out as much as I possibly could, but you'll see later on in the video that those glares are there. So for that, I apologize. But hopefully soon I'll have them just where they need to be so that I can avoid those glares. Anyway, these lamps, they're by Verilux, and the one thing that I love about them is that I can actually adjust the brightness of them, and then I can also adjust the temperature of the color. So the issue I was having with my old lamp when I replaced the bulb was if I was coloring at night, that's when it would flare really, really bad. If I was working on stuff during the day, it was fine. With my new lamps, I can adjust the temperature so that the lamp color or the light is a warmer color when I work in my studio at night, which is when I do most of my work. So another thing that I loved about these lamps, just like the cardstock, is the price point. I did research and I kept trying to find an OT light that I could control the brightness or the temperature of the light, and they didn't have one, and I stumbled across the Verilux lamps, and the Verilux lamps with shipping was $55 compared to the OT lamps. I think the cheapest I found them when they were on sale was, I think, $72. And that was over the Thanksgiving holiday is when I was looking during the Black Friday sales. Quick note about the Santa hats. I did do my normal flicking motion on that. I started out with the darkest color and added that in like just above the white rim. Then I went in with my mid-tone R29 and filled in most of it, but I left some white space to blend out so I could have a nice highlight with R24. For the rim of the hat and then the little pom-pom, I just used C3, C1, and then I blended it out with a C00. And I only showed how I colored one hat because I colored all of them the same way. I did come back to the little orange kitty because he had stripes on his back, and I tried to leave the stripes out and just do the furry texture, but I wasn't really happy with how that turned out. So I did go back in and I just colored in the stripes with the E55 or the E35. I think it was E55. And then for the warm gray kitty, I wanted to work on the spot on his back a little bit because it kind of looked like he just had a gray flat bald spot. So I decided to go in and add a little bit more texture with just adding a few dots here and there on the spot on his back. I also knew that one of the Santa hats was going to be covering up most of it, so I didn't worry too much about it. Now for the fish and the fish bowl, that little fish is very tiny, so I only used 2 colors and just did the very bottom of him with BB04 and then finished him up with BB02. For the fishbowl, I started out with C5 and just did tiny little lines, and you'll see that I left white space around the very edge of it just to try and get a more reflective appearance or a more glass appearance. I blended out the C5 with C3, and then I blended that out with the C1. Now at the top of the fishbowl, I actually go over the kitty's paw with the gray marker so that it would look like he was dipping his paw into the little fishbowl. And then I finished up to color in the water that would be in the fishbowl. I used BV10 and let that settle in a bit, and then went over again with C1 just to have more of a highlight in the center of that fishbowl so that it would appear to be more round. I added a little bit of gravel at the bottom of the fishbowl with E44 and W4, and that finishes up the coloring. So for the background, I actually ended up using another Slimline die from Trinity Stamps, and it's the Stitched and Squares Slimline die. And I die cut that from Bristol Smooth cardstock since I was going to be doing some ink blending. And here are those glares on my mat from my new lamps. So I hope they're not too imposing. Anyway, I inked up the long stitched rectangle panel with Pine Needles Distress Oxide ink using a makeup brush. And then I inked the bottom part with Evergreen Bow Distress Oxide ink, again using a makeup brush. Once I was done inking the background, I spritzed a little bit of water to activate that ink and picked up the excess water with just a paper towel. I set that aside to dry and started adhering the little Santa hats to my kitties. I did use the coordinating dies to cut the cats out, and then I just fussy cut the Santa hats. And after I had cut them, I did go around the edge with a water-based black marker just to clean up the not so clean areas where I did the cutting. I used liquid adhesive to adhere the Santa hats to each of the kitties. After I adhered all the little Santa hats, I set those aside to dry, and then I adhered the ink blended panel to a white note card, and I cut that white note card down to 8.5 by 7.25, and it was the perfect size just to leave a tiny little white border around the ink blended panel. The Slimline postage die from Whimsy Stamps, I just cut that obviously out of white cardstock and decided to add a whole bunch of foam tape on the back of that so that I could have just a little bit of dimension. Once I had all the foam tape on there and removed the release paper, I pressed that into place on the front of my card. To adhere the little kitties, I used foam tape, but I only put it like at the very top of each of the kitties so that the bottoms of the kitties would be flush with the postage die cut, the Slimline postage die cut. After I had the kitties in place, it was time to adhere the words Merry Christmas, which I had die cut from red glitter cardstock, and the die is also from Trinity Stamps. The die cut words are really very delicate, so I just picked them up with my tweezers and used liquid glue to adhere them. And one of the things that I like to do when working with such delicate dies is I just dot a very small amount of glue on the back, and then I take it and tap the excess glue off onto a piece of scratch paper. It helps to kind of smush the glue around on the back so I have better coverage, and I don't have to worry about all of the glue squishing out all over on my project. And to finish up the card, I added a little bit of sparkle to the white parts of the Santa hats with some Stardust stickles. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.